Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Future Security Initiative Spring Speaker Series for 2024. We're thrilled to have our colleague, Jeremy Hodge, who's a senior investigator at the Zomia Center and also a research fellow with us here at the Future Security Initiative. And he'll be speaking with us today, and thank you all for joining us. Very briefly, the Future Security Initiative is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. And we work on a variety of different issues having to do with, as you'd imagine, the future of security, but with a focus moving away from kind of traditional militaristic approaches and more towards a kind of, let's call it a holistic approach, a human security approach. Jeremy is a researcher, a political analyst, and an investigative journalist covering state business relations and security in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. He is a contributor to Proxy War Today, Case Studies of Conflict in the Middle East. That's a book that we put out, our Future Security Initiative team. It's a multi-year grant that we ran. That's to say ASU faculty and New America colleagues, Jeremy being one of them. He's also the co-author of the 2015 African Confidential Investigation, Opening the Black Box of Egypt's slush funds that exposed a $9.4 billion network of corruption among the country's generals. His works appeared in many publications, including Foreign Affairs, The Daily Beast, The Nation, Monde Diplomatique, Al-Jazeera, and other outlets. We're thrilled to have Jeremy with us. We're thrilled that Jeremy has, as of about a year ago, joined us here at the Future Security Initiative. Thank you all, and I'll turn over the talk to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, very much. And thank you, everybody attending this talk right now. As Daniel mentioned, I am a fellow at Arizona State University's Future Security Initiative. Today, I'm going to be talking about Russia's operations in Syria or the Middle East more broadly, and specifically how Russia uses its military assets in Syria to threaten NATO and to challenge NATO broadly and in a more global sense. Now, of course, when people talk about Russia and NATO or Russia and the United States, we all tend to think of the war in Ukraine, which is, of course, dominated the headlines of the world for the last 2 years. However, traditionally, the Middle East has also been one of the most important theaters within which Russia has challenged the United States and its adversaries on the European continent going back several hundred years. So just for clarification, throughout this presentation, whenever I talk about Russia, I'm not only talking about the modern day state of Russia. I'm often going to be talking about the Soviet Union, but I'm also going to be talking about the Tsarist Empire, which was founded in the early 1700s and, of course, preceded the Soviet Union. So I just want to make that clear. Right now, I'm going to share my screen and start off with a little presentation for everybody. As you can see, right here, we have a map of Russia and Eastern Europe. So I've put this up here to illustrate a few things about geography. So the three main entities that I've discussed so far, the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Union, and the modern-day state of Russia, for most of their history, and especially prior to the Cold War, these countries were effectively, for all intents and purposes, landlocked nations, or a landlocked country. Now, this seems counterintuitive. I don't literally mean that Russia is a landlocked country. It's obviously surrounded by, or at least Western Russia is surrounded by three main bodies of water, which you see in front of you now: the Arctic Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Black Sea. However, for the majority of its history, and again before the Cold War, the entrances to all three of these seas were mostly blocked off to Russian naval assets and Russian ships that attempted to sail through them in order to access larger and more important bodies of water, such as the Atlantic Ocean or the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, throughout the imperial period, throughout the 1800s and 1900s, the Atlantic Ocean was very crucial for competition between great powers and great European powers. However, for Russia, it was, as I stated, unable to break out of these three seas around its western borders in order to take part in the competition between these great powers in different parts of the world. Now, the reasons for this are relatively simple. In the Arctic Sea to the north, for most of its history, Russia was unable to sail through the Arctic Sea simply because of the vast amount of ice that covers the Arctic region that is impenetrable, or was impenetrable at the time, to most naval forces. So not just Russia, but it was very difficult, of course, in the 1800s, 1900s for most countries' navies to sail around the Arctic, and Russia was no exception. So again, before the creation of icebreakers in the second half of the 20th century, the Arctic Sea was basically blocked off to Russia. Now, the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea were blocked off to Russia and the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union during this time, mostly because the straits and the entrances leading into both of these seas were controlled by hostile powers that had been adversaries to Russia for an extended period of time and could effectively shut off or blockade the entrances to these seas whenever they saw fit. So the straits to the Baltic Sea, or the Baltic Straits, were and are still controlled by the country of Denmark. Denmark is now, of course, a NATO country. However, even in the 1800s, Denmark had traditionally been an adversary of Russia and often blocked off the Baltic Straits so that Russian naval ships could not break through them and access the Atlantic. Russia and Denmark reached an agreement in 1857 that enabled Russian ships to sail through this area freely. However, the status of the straits was always kind of at risk for Russia. During World War I and World War II, Germany took over Denmark, and during both of those wars, completely sealed off the straits leading into the Baltic Sea to Russian ships. And actually, during both wars, World War I and World War II, Germany allied with the country of Finland right on Russia's border, and basically through that alliance forced Russian or confined and trapped Russian ships into the farthest easternmost part of the Baltic Sea, a little area called the Gulf of Finland, which is that very narrow horizontal strip right below Finland itself. During both world wars, that was the extent that Russia's ships could travel within and throughout the Baltic Sea. This was obviously, for Russian military strategists and planners, a traumatic experience. Maybe that's not the right word, but it was a very revelatory experience that very much outlined the vulnerabilities of Russia's navy. In the event that a hostile power ever took over the Baltic Straits and wanted to shut Russia out of the broader region, they could. And the Nazis and the Germans in World War I did that. Since in the Cold War, that hasn't since happened. However, throughout the Cold War, there was often talk amongst NATO planners of shutting Russia and the Soviet Union out of the Atlantic through the Baltic Straits. So similarly, there's the Black Sea and the Turkish Straits, which lead from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Now, this region has been much more contentious for Russia and the Soviet Union. During the Tsarist period, for almost the entirety of the 1800s, these straits leading into the Black Sea were completely blocked off to Russian ships by the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans did this because of their alliance with the British, who were enemies of the Tsarist Empire. And for almost the entirety of the 1800s, Russian ships could not access the Mediterranean Sea at all. There were brief exceptions to this. There were some little periods where it happened. However, for the most part, the Mediterranean Sea, and by extension, the African continent, and even much of the Middle East, was completely inaccessible to Russian ships. In the 20th century, in 1936, this was continued through a treaty called the Treaty of Montreux, or the Montreux Convention, which was signed during World War II. Which basically required that any nation seeking to sail from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean through the Turkish Straits had to provide 8 days warning in advance to the country of Turkey, which controlled them. Now, obviously, during the Cold War, Turkey became a NATO member, and this convention was still in play at the time, and it still remains in effect. And so what this convention effectively means is that anytime that the Russians want to sail from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, they have to provide Turkey, a NATO country, 8 days advance warning, which is plenty of time and ample time for the United States or NATO or any other country to prepare for that and to take into account any contingencies and challenge Russia. So all that being said, it's important to look at this map and understand that, again, for most of its history, from the early 1700s up until the Cold War, and even throughout most of the Cold War, Russia was landlocked for all intents and purposes. It was limited to this big landmass of Eurasia. And it's for this reason that the overwhelming majority of Russia's military and imperialist expansion during this time was exclusively limited to areas that they could access by land. Almost exclusively to the east, in Siberia, in the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. With very few exceptions, Russia had almost no imperial, military, or even commercial presence on the African continent, in North America, in South America, throughout the imperialist period, and even for some of the Cold War. And again, this is because of the blocking of Russia's military capabilities along the Arctic, the Baltic, and the Black Sea. So this is a very important framework with which to understand Russia's broader motivations for the region. And I think it's best understood by seeing it displayed physically, as you guys do now. All that being said, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union worked very, very hard to get around the constraints imposed by Turkey between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And they did this by trying to cultivate alliances with countries in the Mediterranean that could then offer the Soviet Union permanent access to their ports to be converted into naval facilities for Russian warships and to Russian submarines, so that Russia could permanently dock warships and submarines at the ports of these countries, thereby not having to provide any notice to Turkey or anybody else about their movements from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The first country to do this was Albania in 1958. From 1958 to 1961, the Soviet Union did permanently dock its warships and submarines in Albania. This ended in 1961 after a major diplomatic crisis erupted between both countries, and the Albanians effectively, well, they kicked out the Soviet military presence in their country, but they also broke from the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact and the Communist Pact in Eastern Europe at the time, and remained independent of them in 1961. Next up was Egypt. So as many of you will likely know, Egypt, Syria, and other Arab countries fought and lost a war against Israel in 1967. This was a major blow for Egypt and all the other Arab countries. And after the war, Egypt reached out to the Soviet Union to cultivate a close military relationship with Moscow, to train its military and to protect its borders against the threat of any potential Israeli or future Israeli incursion into Egyptian territory. The Soviet Union was happy to do this and deployed 15,000 military advisors to Egypt in 1967. However, in exchange, the Soviet Union demanded something very specific, and you can probably guess what it was, which was permanent access to Egypt's ports on its coast, in addition to 7 military air bases across the country. Egypt was happy to oblige, and Egypt granted the Soviet Union this access. And from 1967 to 1972, for the first time in hundreds of years, the Soviet Union was able to reliably enjoy a permanent presence on the Mediterranean. This was a major accomplishment for the Soviet Union. Again, for 5 years, 15,000 Soviet troops were in the country, and Soviet warships and submarines could permanently dock at Egyptian ports. In some of these ports, the Soviet Union was granted jurisdictional immunity, which basically means that, in colloquial terms, jurisdictional immunity means that they enjoy total control over the ports. Soviet law prevailed within the ports, not Egyptian law. Egyptians who wanted to enter the ports needed to obtain Soviet permission, and so forth. So this was a major, major coup on behalf of the Soviet Union, and significantly increased its deterrence against NATO, because now Soviet warships and submarines could permanently dock in the Mediterranean and threaten NATO positions elsewhere. For example, in Italy and France. Italy specifically was where the U.S. 6th Naval Fleet was stationed. Now, all of a sudden, that the status of that fleet was in jeopardy. And it's also worth mentioning that many of these warships and naval and submarines were nuclear equipped or could be equipped with nuclear weapons. So by gaining access to Egypt's ports, the Soviet Union was able to project nuclear deterrence along along NATO's southern flank and Europe's southern flank, which was a major threat to NATO. And it was almost similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis for the United States, although in this respect, directed towards Europe. Unfortunately, though, for the Soviet Union, this ended in 1972 when a new Egyptian government under Anwar Sadat decided to switch sides in the Cold War, cut its ties with the Soviet Union, and instead cultivate ties with the United States, pursue rapprochement with Israel, and of course, eventually sign a peace treaty with Israel. And beginning in 1972, Anwar Sadat and Egypt expelled all the Soviet military advisors from Egypt in 7 stages and denied the Soviets access to their ports and air bases and lifted jurisdictional immunity for Soviets within the country. So Soviet Union scored a major victory, but within 5 years, the victory was over. The Soviet Union continued to try to cultivate similar relationships with other countries in the Mediterranean, however, largely failed for the remainder of the Cold War. In 1971, the Soviet Union built a port in Syria called the Tartus port. After being expelled from Egypt, the Soviet Union tried to convince the Hafez al-Assad government in Syria to allow them permanent access to the Tartus port as they had previously enjoyed in Egypt. However, the Assad regime refused because they were scared that doing so would invite unwanted threats and scrutiny from the United States and NATO, which was not incorrect. Similarly, between 1976 and 1985, the Soviet Union enjoyed temporary access to 3 separate ports in Libya. But again, emphasis on temporary. They did not enjoy permanent access as they had in Egypt earlier. And for the rest of the Cold War, which extends until about 1990, but really only until 1985, the Soviet Union has almost no presence in the Mediterranean at all, except for some minor presence in Syria and Libya. However, at the bases in Syria and Libya, the Soviet Union could only use these bases to refuel, to resupply, to transport ships, but they did not have jurisdictional immunity and could not come and go as they pleased. So by the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is basically what the map of Soviet control in the Mediterranean looked like, with some minor exceptions, but mostly they had no access. Okay. This began to change starting in 2007. 2007 was a major break from the past and a major watershed moment in the post-Cold War period. It was the year that President Vladimir Putin gave his famous Munich speech at the Munich Security Conference in Germany. Now, this speech was very important and significant because it was the first time that Putin had ever publicly and openly criticized the United States and U.S. foreign policy since coming to power. During the speech, Putin was very critical of the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, and basically accused the United States of going around the world and using its military to threaten and coerce smaller and weaker countries around the world to do whatever it wanted. We're all kind of familiar with this talking point, and it's not entirely incorrect. However, irrespective as to what you may think of Putin's characterization of U.S. foreign policy at that time, it's important to note that when Putin talks about U.S. foreign policy in this respect, he is mostly using it as a pretext to re-extend the Russian Empire or to re-extend Russia's military facilities outside of the former Soviet Union. We have a quote from this speech right here where Putin states, "We are seeing a greater and greater disdain under the United States for the basic principles of international law. This is extremely dangerous. We have reached that decisive moment where we must seriously think about the architecture of global security." Again, when Putin is discussing the architecture of global security and rethinking the architecture of global security, what he means is reestablishing Russian military bases abroad outside the former Soviet Union, specifically in the Mediterranean, and even more specifically in Libya and Syria, 2 countries that the Soviet Union tried to establish permanent bases in during the Cold War. About 1 year after the Munich speech, Russia, the modern day state of Russia now, began a massive overhaul and reform of its military and armed forces, significantly increasing defense spending, significantly increasing recruitment in order to increase the number of troops under Russian military command, and investing in new technologies and weapons in order to significantly improve the lethality and effectiveness of Russia's military forces. That year, Russia launched its war in Georgia and invaded the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And as we know now, looking back, this was a period after which Russia's military adventures across the region significantly grew. As this was happening in 2008, Putin actively made efforts to reestablish Russia's presence on the Mediterranean again. In April 2008, Putin met with Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi. Later in October 2008, Gaddafi reciprocated and visited Moscow. During the trip, Putin during Gaddafi's trip to Moscow, and during both trips, both men discussed a number of things, including Russian investments in Libya. Putin agreed to forgive $4.5 billion of Libyan's Soviet-era debt, in addition to a number of arms deals. But most importantly, Russia proposed and floated the idea of Libya allowing Russia to use its port of Benghazi and other ports across the country as permanent military bases, as it had attempted to do in the Soviet Union. Similarly, around this time, in August 2008, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad visited Russia and met with Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, during which both men discussed very similar topics. Medvedev proposed increased Russian investment into Syria. Both men discussed increasing arms deals between both countries, but also Medvedev requested that Syria convert the Tartus port, which the Soviet Union had built in 1971, to be converted into a permanent Russian military base, where once again, Russian warships and potentially nuclear-equipped submarines could deploy. By January 2009, this wasn't just hearsay. The Russian state-owned media had begun to report very heavily on these plans to convert Libya and Syrian ports into permanent Russian military bases, and were actively stating that Russia had plans within the next several years to reopen permanent bases in both of these countries. Of course, we don't know the extent to which these plans were seriously considered by any of the parties involved ahead of time, but we do know that all of these plans were completely upended in 2011 with the outbreak of the Arab Spring. As many of you know, the Arab Spring was a string of revolutions that occurred throughout the region in many Arab countries, the most violent of which coincidentally occurred in Libya and Syria, the two countries that Putin was hoping to reestablish military bases at. As many of you know, Libyan President Gaddafi was killed by Libyan rebels in 2011. Though President Assad in Syria was not killed, he managed to hang on to power and in fact remains president of Syria to this day. He very quickly lost control of the vast majority of territory within Syria to hundreds of various rebel groups and terrorist organizations. This is a map of Syria in 2015, 4 years after the Arab Spring, and it shows the map of control of all the different parties to the Syrian conflict and what areas fell under whose control. The territory in the red is the territory controlled by Bashar al-Assad and his government, and as you can see, is limited almost exclusively to the far west of the country, and probably consists of less than a quarter or 25% of the entire territory of Syria. The territory in green is the territory held by Syrian rebels and opposition groups attempting to overthrow the Assad regime. The territory in the far north of the country in yellow is territory controlled by the Syrian Kurdish YPG, which later allied with the United States. And then the massive territory in the center and east of the country in black is territory controlled by ISIS, the terrorist group that I know all of you have heard of. So by this point, as is very obvious in the map, the balance of power in Syria in 2015 was very different than it was in 2008, when Dmitry Medvedev and Russia first made their proposal to establish a permanent Russian naval base in Syria. At this point, President Assad was in control of, again, about only 25% of the country, and his regime was on the verge of collapse. At this point in time, the moment captured by this map, both ISIS and Syrian rebels had made significant gains within the country. And even though Iran had intervened in Syria and provided the Assad regime with significant assistance in terms of money and weapons, and even personnel and foreign militiamen from other parts of the world who fought in support of Assad, Assad was on the verge of collapse at this point. And he reached out, and the Assad regime in August 2015 requested or made a request to Russia for Russian military forces to intervene in the conflict on the side of Bashar al-Assad to help fight against the various rebel groups in the country and push back the oncoming wave that threatened to overthrow the Assad government. Again, as in Egypt in 1967, Putin and Russia were very happy to help Assad and very quickly deployed several thousand troops to Syria, including significant Air Force assets that over the next several years significantly bombed and pushed back the oncoming tidal wave of Syrian rebel forces and ISIS. Of course, as in Egypt, there were certain conditions. Russia demanded in exchange that the Tartus port, which the Soviet Union built in 1971, be converted into a permanent Russian naval facility. And the Assad regime agreed to this and reestablished jurisdictional immunity within the Tartus port for Russians, the same terms that were agreed by Egypt in 1967. Just to review, these terms include Russian law applying within the port itself, not Syrian law, and that Syrians attempting to enter the port need Russian permission. So basically, the Tartus port went from being a Syrian port that Russia had built to basically an extension of Russian territorial sovereignty that they controlled. And over the next 3 years after this arrangement was struck, Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, proceeded to make significant gains in the country. This is a map of Syria in 2018 and shows just the significant amount of territory that Assad was able to claw back, both from ISIS and from Syrian rebels, with the aid of Russian Air Force and military power. So it's kind of important to stop for a second here and just kind of review what has happened to this point. Since the early 1700s, Russia has been denied access to the broader world, and specifically to the broader large bodies of water throughout the world, including the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, because of geography and because of the hostility that it faced from other countries and adversaries on the European continent that blocked its access. Starting in the Cold War, Russia tried very hard to get around the constraints imposed in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea by establishing naval facilities in Albania, in Egypt, Syria, and Libya. However, none of these came to fruition. However, now, after helping Assad claw back significant territory within Syria, Russia has achieved all of those aims. And Russia now, in 2024, is perhaps better positioned than any previous iteration of Russia or the Russian Empire to extend its influence throughout the Mediterranean than any previous government has over for the last several hundred years. We often think of the Soviet Union as having been stronger and better positioned than modern day Russia to confront NATO. And in many ways, that is true. In Eastern Europe, Russia today is significantly weaker than the Soviet Union and the Tsarist Empire were. However, in the Mediterranean Sea, Russia today is far stronger and far more powerful than the Soviet Union ever was. The reason for this is, and I maybe should have mentioned this a minute ago, is that the original deal between the Assad regime and Russia in 2015 that guaranteed Russian access to the Tartus port, that was a deal that is guaranteed to last for a minimum of 50 years. So Russia technically leases the Tartus port from Syria, and at the very least has leasing rights to the port for the next 50 years. So unlike in Egypt, where Egypt kicked the Russians out after 5 years, Russia is guaranteed to have access to the Tartus port for 50 years. So again, just to reiterate, whereas in Eastern Europe, Russia is weaker than the Soviet Union was because it's having trouble recapturing territory in Ukraine. It doesn't control the majority of Eastern Europe as the Soviet Union did under the Warsaw Pact. In the Mediterranean, Russia is stronger now than the Soviet Union was and stronger than the Tsarist Empire before that. So that's very important to point out. We're wrapping up here, but just to kind of make another point, this is a map of Syria that you can see the Tartus port in. However, there's also another facility called the Hamimim facility that Russia built in 2015 when it first intervened in Syria. The Hamimim facility, unlike Tartus, is an air base. It's not a port. So there are no Russian warships or submarines there. However, the Hamimim air base is an extraordinarily large air base that Russia that has two very large airstrips that Russia can use to host very heavy aircraft capable of transporting and moving significant quantities of weapons and personnel all over the world. These two facilities, Tartus and Hamimim, are the largest Russian military facilities outside of the former Soviet Union, and Russia has exploited them to a significant end in order to expand its reach even further, not just into the Mediterranean region, but into the African continent, a region that, again, during the era of the Tsarist Empire, during the imperialist era, Russia was unable to access Africa almost at all. There was almost no Russian military, imperial, colonial, or commercial presence in Russia. However, today, Russia is extraordinarily influential within Africa, excuse me. And it is because of this base, the Hamimim base, which it can use to refuel ships coming in from Russia and then send them out to other locations. So this is a map of Russia. And right here we have three arrows pointing to locations in Africa that Russia significantly expanded its footprint in beginning in 2018. 2018 was a very important year for Russia and for Syria because it was the year that ISIS was mostly defeated. It had lost its territory in Iraq, in the city of Mosul, but also across most of Syria. In December 2017, Putin declared the war in Syria over, made a very big effort to try to begin winding down the conflict and attempted to reach a political solution between the Assad regime and Syrian rebels. However, with all this, it used this now new freed up space that it had to begin expanding its footprint into Africa. These arrows point to the countries of Sudan, Central African Republic, and Libya. In 2018, Russia deployed several thousand mercenaries affiliated with the Wagner Group, which many of you may have heard of, which was the most prominent Russian mercenary group over the last 10 years or so. Thousands of Wagner mercenaries were deployed from the Hamimim base in Syria to Sudan and the Central African Republic in 2018, and then again to Libya in early 2019. In these countries, Wagner forces and Russian special operations forces were involved in three major conflicts. In Sudan, there was a massive revolution that overthrew the president of Omar al-Bashir in 2018 and 2019. Wagner and Russian forces were there in Sudan to repress protests and shepherd the military council in Sudan into power. Wagner forces participated very much in repressing the revolution in Sudan in 2018 and 2019. In Libya, from September 2019 until about June 2020, Russian proxies in Libya, known as the Libyan National Army, commanded by a renegade warlord named Khalifa Haftar, launched a massive assault to recapture the Libyan capital of Tripoli from Libya's internationally recognized government. Russian Wagner mercenaries and Russian special operations forces were present in Libya for that battle and assisted Haftar in that assault. In Central African Republic, starting in December 2020 and then lasting until May 2021, Russian Wagner forces and Spetsnaz forces, Spetsnaz being the special forces, helped the Central African Republic's government push back a major rebel assault on the capital of Bangui that without Russian help may have succeeded. The Central African Republic has been involved in its own civil war since 2016. In that country, Russia supports the Central African Republic's government against rebels. And again, so from December 2020 to May 2021, Russian Wagner forces were in the Central African Republic supporting the government against the rebel-led push in these areas. We're almost done. However, I'm just going to end with this right here. So this is a map of Libya, and it shows all the facilities and territory that Russia was able to conquer or take for itself in Libya during the September 2019 to June 2020 conflict there. The facilities in red are all military bases and air bases. The El Qadim base in the northeast, or the El Khadim base in Arabic, is another major air base, which, like Hamimim in Syria, Russia uses to ship its naval forces across the continent into brand new theaters all over the region. The facilities in blue, which are the Asidr, Zoitina, Roslanuf, Zilla, and Sharara facilities, these are all either oil reserves, oil fields, or oil processing, refining, and exporting facilities. After the assault on Tripoli by Russia's proxy, Khalifa Haftar, Wagner forces deployed and took over all of these facilities and to this day effectively control them. The energy and oil facilities are particularly important because Libya is a major producer of oil. Its production reaches above 1 million barrels per day in some instances. However, by controlling the export facilities, Russia is able to limit the amount of oil that Libya exports, which can affect international oil prices. And of course, considering that Libya exports most of its oil to Europe, this is effectively a blockade that Russia can enforce, an energy blockade that Russia can enforce against Europe from Libya. And throughout 2020 and 2022 and other times, Wagner forces at these facilities unilaterally decided to limit Libyan oil production in an attempt to drive up oil prices and reduce the amount of energy resources or exports being sent into Europe. There's other maps that I put together for this. Russia has expanded its footprint into many of the countries that are showing up on the screen right now. However, I'm going to stop right there and I'm going to open it up for questions. Yeah, so that's all. Thank you very much.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Let's also remove from the screen the shared screen. Great.
Sure.
And make it disappear if we can. But that was really wonderful. Thank you. That was a really exceptional presentation. It draws attention to something I think that has not been picked up by a lot of folks paying attention to the world and the region, which is this claim, almost counterintuitive, that Russia now has an ability to project even greater challenge to NATO forces and to the West writ large through its expansion in the Middle East.
Mhm.
With this in mind, what can you tell us about how this increased power, how it plays out in the current crisis in the Middle East? That is to say, in the crisis of Israeli activities in Gaza, the recent Iranian attack on Israel. How does Russia's increasing role, its growing military capability, what does Russia want, and what does that mean for the current crisis?
Sure. Absolutely. And of course, Iran is, and especially in Syria and the Middle East generally, Russia and Iran are integrally linked together. And Iran is very much involved in facilitating and forwarding Russia's foreign policy agenda in the region. As a result of the Syrian conflict, obviously, in addition to Russia, Iran sent large numbers of forces to Syria to help prop up the Assad regime. When distinguishing between Russia and Iran and Syria, it's important to emphasize which regions of the country are important for either one. So as I discussed in my talk, Russia is mostly only considers to be important the coastal region of Syria, the western coast, because of the Tartus port and Hamamim air base. What happens with the rest of the country is not really that important to Russia. So long as the Assad regime continues to exist and it continues to adhere to the agreements that give Russia access to Tartus and Hamimim. What happens elsewhere in the country is not really of much concern to Russia. And so while Russia has helped prop up the Assad regime, its forces are mostly concentrated in the coastal region around Damascus and a couple other select locations in the west of the country. The vast rest of the territory in the south of the country and the center and the east of the country that the Assad regime now controls is mostly patrolled by and occupied by Iranian-backed forces that Russia has made almost no attempt to try to repel or to reduce their influence in any way. There were some agreements in 2018 as kind of hostilities drew to a close between Russia, Israel, and the United States, in which Russia pledged to kind of limit the expansion of Iranian militias in certain sensitive parts of the country, like southern Syria on the border with Jordan, which Israel was very concerned about, obviously, because Israel does not want Iranian militias near its border or the border with Jordan because they can smuggle weapons into Israel and the West Bank. Russia made some effort to try to nominally pledge to limit Iranian influence in that region, but it failed to do so due to lack of capacity. It didn't have the military forces available to stop any Iranian expansion into southern Syria, but also just a lack of incentives. It has no reason to really resist Iranian encroachment in that way, as long as it controls the Hamimim base and the Tartus base. So what's happened since 2018, as Russia has redirected its focus to Africa, and intervening in many conflicts across Africa, Iran has taken advantage of this kind of gap in Russia's focus, or Russia being, being interested in other parts of the world. Iran has kind of filled this void and taken over most of southern Syria for itself, and its militias and proxies, especially since 2022, have begun a massive campaign of smuggling of weapons into Jordan and into the West Bank, which has triggered a massive uptick in violence in the West Bank amongst Palestinians attacking Israeli troops, which has a lot to do with the current conflict in Gaza because, there's just been a general escalation between the IDF and various Palestinian groups, not just in Gaza, but also the West Bank. And this can largely be attributed to Iran's footprint in southern Syria, which has been enabled by Russia in many ways.
For those in attendance, if you have any questions for Jeremy, please drop them into the Q&A box. We have one question here from Christopher Harrison. Have you seen indications that Wagner, which is now part of the GRU, is involved in Assad's Captagon production and sales? And by the way, Jeremy, maybe you could explain a little bit of what that is for those less familiar.
Sure. So Captagon is a cheap amphetamine in pill form. It's about this big. That's become very popular throughout the Middle East. It was originally created as a normal prescription drug in the 1980s, but it was made illegal. I'm not sure exactly why, but it's just not safe to consume. It's been very popular throughout the Middle East since the 1980s. Hezbollah's produced Captagon in significant quantities since the 1980s in Lebanon, and as war has spread throughout Syria and in general instability, Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies have used Syrian territory to produce massive amounts of Captagon. And when I say massive, I mean upwards of 10, I mean, some estimates say $30 billion of Captagon annually are distributed from Syria across the region. But more likely it's probably about $10 billion annually. And this is directly overseen by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the Syrian Army's 4th Armored Division, which is run by President Bashar al-Assad's brother, Maher al-Assad. So this is state-sanctioned, government-controlled drug production and trafficking, similar to what happened with Noriega in Panama in the 1980s, however, on a much larger scale. These drugs have flooded Jordan and especially Saudi Arabia, which is the largest market for drugs in the region, and it's produced all kinds of security problems for states in the region, because obviously with an increase in drug consumption comes drug trafficking, which comes crime, which comes the growth of organized crime, and in many instances, very, very heavily armed groups operating within the borders of Jordan and even Saudi Arabia that are committing acts of violence and trafficking drugs. And so and they're doing so, it's not my opinion, at the behest of Iran and its proxies in the region. So back to the question, Wagner being involved in Captagon production. Well, just as a quick note, Wagner technically doesn't exist anymore. Since June 2023, some of you may remember the leader of Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin, launched a massive mutiny against Russian Ministry of Defense forces in the city of Rostov-on-Don. And this was a major, this is a huge problem for Russia because Russia relied heavily on Wagner forces in Ukraine and elsewhere. About a month after that, Prigozhin himself was killed mysteriously in an airplane crash. So Wagner does not exist anymore. And its forces have been absorbed into other mercenary groups, in particular Africa Corps, which is a new Russian mercenary group that's mostly, unsurprisingly, mostly operates in Africa. Now, again, apologies for the long tangent. However, Wagner in Syria has not really been reconstituted. Since the Prigozhin mutiny, Wagner mercenaries in Syria were given an ultimatum by Russia's Ministry of Defense. And this ultimatum was to join Russia's formal Ministry of Defense-backed units operating in Syria, which receive less money and fewer benefits, or leave Syria. And I don't know exactly how many chose either option. However, all reports indicate that the vast majority of Wagner troops in Syria decided to leave Syria rather than join the Ministry of Defense forces in Syria. And this is not just claims that this has happened. The areas of Syria that Wagner used to patrol heavily have now seen a massive resurgence of ISIS attacks since the Prigozhin mutiny. And the reason is because nobody has come back to replace them. There has not been a comparable deployment of Russian formal military troops into areas of Syria formerly patrolled by Wagner. Similarly, Iranian proxies have not filled the void left behind by Wagner in Syria. And ever since the October 7th attacks and the subsequent Israeli war in Gaza with Hamas, Iranian troops have actually even pulled back a little bit in Syria because they are fearful of being targeted in airstrikes, excuse me. And so many of the parts of Syria where Wagner used to operate are now not being patrolled by Wagner. And we know this not just because of local sources claiming that, but because there is now an increased ISIS presence in these areas. And it is growing and growing month by month. All that being said, back to Captagon, I am sure that there has been Wagner that some Wagner members have been implicated in Captagon trafficking. Excuse me. The Tartus port, which is exclusively controlled by Russia, has seen massive Captagon exports leave from the port. There's been massive Captagon shipments in Greece and Italy and Saudi Arabia of millions and millions of pills that left from the Tartus port. And remember, Russia enjoys jurisdictional immunity within the Tartus port. So this is a port that is where Russian law applies, and for Syrians to enter, they need Russian permission. So if there are Captagon exports leaving from Tartus, absolutely Russia is involved. Or at the very least, I mean, they did nothing to stop it. However, the drawdown in Wagner's presence in Syria since the Prigozhin mutiny means that even if they are involved in Captagon trafficking, the proportion which they are involved compared to Iranian proxies is very, very small, if not negligible.
Thank you so much. A question here, excuse me, from Noor Abed. Great one, Jeremy. Thank you for the informative presentation. Given the recent developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, could you share your perspective on how these events might influence Iran and Russia's relationship with Assad?
Well, I mean, I don't think Russia or Iran's relationship with Assad was planning on changing or will change, really depending on it, or will change no matter what happens in the region. As I said, Russia's lease on the Tartus port and the Hamimim Air Base will last for 50 years. And irrespective as to what happens in the region, Russia is going to maintain that relationship with Assad because of those two facilities. And the same goes for Iran. I could do there's other things that can be said about Iran's interest in Syria. Iran very much uses Syria as kind of a headquarters or a central node where all of its various proxies from all over the world kind of meet and organize, right? So Iranian proxies in Iraq and Yemen, even Afghanistan and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Syria is where they come to meet to kind of coordinate their activities, build serious infrastructure to ensure that they have a permanent presence in the region. Syria is also Iran's the final step in Iran's land bridge to access the Mediterranean. Obviously Iran has its own plans for the region, most important of which is to gain direct land access to the Mediterranean in order to do many things. Decades ago, Iran had the idea that it wanted to build pipelines across Iraq and Syria to Europe. A big part of the Iran nuclear deal to lift sanctions on Iran was all about that, so that Europeans could get access to a new source of cheap Iranian gas. Now that's probably less likely to happen. However, Iran very much still values its access to the Mediterranean Ocean for other reasons, not least of which to traffic Captagon, very important, but also to smuggle weapons into the West Bank. So I think that the war in Gaza since October 7th just lends increased urgency to all of these trends, because it just further polarizes the world between it's just another conflict around which the United States, NATO, its allies are on one side, and Russia, Iran, and its allies are on the other side. And so it further polarizes the region, but also the world, and it further incentivizes and further drives Russia and Iran's need to keep a firm lock on Syria, because without Syria, Russia can't project deterrence in the Mediterranean. It can't expand throughout Africa. And without Syria, Iran cannot smuggle weapons into the West Bank. It cannot smuggle drugs anywhere else. And so, yes, the events in Gaza absolutely are going to further solidify and further polarize the region and the world.
An interesting question here from Zaid Al-Madawi, moving a little away from the last question about Russia's role in the Sudanese civil war. And can you comment about Russia's role in the Sudanese civil war and a possible future port in Port Sudan as a naval base?
Absolutely, sure. So yeah, Russia's involvement in the Sudanese civil war is extensive. It gets less attention than other conflicts in Africa that Russia takes part in, because Russia has fewer troops on the ground actively fighting in Sudan. However, Russia is very much contributing to the war. Specifically, so the Sudanese civil war, for those that don't know, is currently being fought between the Sudanese armed forces on the one hand and a irregular paramilitary force known as the Rapid Security Forces. Some of you may remember the Rapid Security Forces from 2 decades ago when they were known as the Janjaweed, which was the pro-government militia responsible for committing human rights abuses and massacres in the Darfur region in the early 2000s. So Janjaweed was kind of a colloquial term that locals used to refer to the militias that carried out these attacks. But in the last 2 decades, the Janjaweed has coalesced and become a formal paramilitary force known as the Rapid Security Forces, which is being controlled by a general named, his last name is Dagalo. I don't remember his first name. However, he's commonly known as Hamedi, the leader of the Rapid Security Forces. The Rapid Security Forces have had very close ties with Russia and the United Arab Emirates for many years. They deployed to Libya in 2019 to support Russia and Russia's proxies' assault on Tripoli. They fought alongside Khalifa Haftar, who was backed by Russia to attack Tripoli. The Rapid Security Forces also deployed to Yemen in 2018 to fight alongside United Arab Emirates forces against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen. So they have a history of supporting Russian and Emirati military conflicts around the world. When the war in Ukraine started, the leader of the Rapid Security Forces, Hamedi himself, the day after the invasion on February 25th, 2022, Hamedi, the leader of the Rapid Security Forces, flew to Moscow and met with Putin. I don't know what they discussed, obviously, but it was that clearly is indicative of something. The Rapid Security Forces are very much a Russian proxy, and Russia arms them directly from a base in eastern Chad, specifically in the town of, I think it's pronounced Amjaras. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. There's a town in eastern Chad spelled Amdjarass, Amjaras, where Russia and the United Arab Emirates established a military base in June 2023. And from that military base, they directly armed the Rapid Security Forces in neighboring Darfur, who are based in a town called Zurug, Z-U-R-U-G. That is the Rapid Security Forces' main base in Darfur. So from Amjaras to Zurug, Russia directly arms the Rapid Security Forces, and that is their involvement in the Sudanese conflict. With regards to the port in Sudan, so Russia's port in Sudan, similar to Russia's Tartus port in Syria, Russia initially reached an agreement with the Sudanese government in December 2020 to build a second port, a permanent naval facility in the city of Port Sudan on the Red Sea. Now, at the time, this was before the Sudanese Civil War, the deal was reached with the Sudanese government, which at the time included both parties of the current civil war. So since the civil war started, that port has been postponed. Construction of the port has been postponed. I would expect that if the Rapid Security Forces won the civil war, they would grant Russia their port. And if the Sudanese armed forces won the civil war, they would not grant Russia its port. That port is very contentious because, well, the Egyptians very much oppose it, because they don't want any foreign power to be patrolling the Red Sea, because that might jeopardize Egypt's operation of the Suez Canal. And we've seen now with Houthi attacks in the Red Sea how Egypt doesn't want any conflict in the Red Sea. They don't want Houthis attacking ships in the Red Sea. They don't want Russia setting up a base in the Red Sea. So Egypt is actually supporting the other side of the Sudanese civil war. So Russia and Egypt are on opposite sides of that civil war. So that's my answer to that question, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. A question here from Jennifer Achaval.
Mhm.
The UN Security Council is voting tomorrow on admitting Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. How do you expect Russia to vote and or react to that vote? And then I'll add, because that's just a sort of one question, I'll add, could you also reflect a little more broadly on Russia's position more generally about the Palestinian cause, about the conflict in Gaza?
Mhm. Yes, so this is a very interesting question. I would expect that Russia would probably support the motion to admit Palestine as a UN member state. I'm not sure about that. generally, if you watch Russian media, if you listen to what Russia has to say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's almost always more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israeli. But Russia is very transactional, and they might decide not to do it for any number of reasons, which have to do with backdoor deals or whatever. I don't know, but I would expect that they would support Palestine's admission to the UN. However, when it comes to Russia's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more generally, and going back several decades, Russia has tried very hard to straddle the line between Israel and Palestine. And before the war in Gaza, actually, Russia and Benjamin Netanyahu had I should say, actually, before the war in Ukraine, before the most recent war in Ukraine, Russia and Israel had pretty, I wouldn't say great ties, but they had good ties. They often met and they coordinated very closely in Syria. And when I say coordinated very closely, what I mean is, as many people may know, Israel has launched hundreds and hundreds of airstrikes in Syria over the last decade, targeting Iranian forces, and they have cooperated with Russia in order to achieve that end. And what I mean by that is Israel has traditionally told Russia ahead of time whenever they're about to bomb an Iranian target in Syria, so that Russian forces can get out of the way, basically. And there's a lot of people suspect that Russia has actually helped Israel carry out some of these airstrikes by providing GPS coordinates about the location of Iranian weapons and warehouses and things like that, in order to use Israel as leverage against Iran, right? Because Russia and Iran might both support President Assad in Syria, but Russia nonetheless would prefer to be the stronger of the two parties. And so helping Israel bomb Iran kind of gives it like a cudgel that it can wield over Iran's head at any given point. So that has traditionally been Israel and Russia's relationship over the last decade at least. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, about 1 million Russian Jews moved to Israel. And that community now is a significant voting bloc within Israel, and has actually been a major conduit between Russia and Israel since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and has facilitated many political initiatives. Russia has tried to walk a fine line between both. Since the war in Ukraine, Israel supported Ukraine fairly vocally during the war in Ukraine, which angered Russia and kind of created tension between both. Israel did that. I'm not really an expert on Eastern Europe, but from what I remember, Israel mostly did that because of things that Russia had done in Syria that angered Israel. For example, using anti-aircraft weapons to challenge Israeli control of Syria's airspace. For example, there were a few instances where Israel bombed Iranian targets in Syria, and Russian-operated anti-aircraft missiles fired on some Israeli ships. Things like that led Israel to support Ukraine very vocally in the war, which angered Russia. And since the recent war in Gaza, Russia has come out very openly, at least in its media, in favor of or against Israel, and in favor of the Palestinian cause. That's my summary of Russia, Israel, Palestine relations. Regarding the UN vote tomorrow, again, I would tentatively say that Russia will probably support Palestine's admission. But again, we're dealing with a country that is extraordinarily transactional, and if given any incentive not to, may very well decide not to. So that's what I would say about that.
Jeremy, thank you so much. We've come to just about the end of our talk. I want to thank everybody who spent some time with us today, and especially to Jeremy for your time. You're beaming in from far away. It's later where you are. Could you just leave us with a very short, if possible, overview of how all of your research, your really path-breaking research on these issues, how the U.S. should craft its policy in relationship to the ways in which Russia has been mobilizing its forces and its power within the Middle East? I know that's a big ask, but maybe just a quick like set of one or two suggestions, and then we'll close out.
Sure. Well, the United States, obviously, since the war in Gaza began, has deployed significant military assets to the Middle East, mostly to deter Iranian attacks on Israel. However, I think that the United States needs to re-engage with the region, and especially not necessarily re-engage from a hard power angle, not necessarily deploying large numbers of forces, but much more engaging and attempting to cultivate new proxies throughout the region that can help attempt to contain Russian and Iranian expansionist efforts in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia increasingly. Again, going back to Iran, Iran has kind of exploited the vacuum within Syria, and Russia being concerned more with events in Ukraine and Africa and elsewhere, to really step up its efforts to cultivate proxy forces in new countries that traditionally have been considered kind of off limits to Iran and stable and safe, including Jordan and including Saudi Arabia. If Iran succeeds in significantly expanding its proxy footprint in these countries, U.S. military assets like the U.S. Navy, Navy's Fifth Fleet, and others could be put in jeopardy in the medium to long term. So kind of reestablishing U.S. presence in the region, not from a hard power perspective, but diplomatically, but also from understanding the local fault lines within the countries, within the region's various countries, understanding how to best cultivate allies within them, I think is the most important thing that the U.S. can do going forward in the Middle East, but also in Northern Africa, where Russian expansion has been extraordinarily successful over the last few years.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and have a good day.
Thank you.